That night, my husband raised his glass before 200 guests, smirking that I had hit the jackpot by marrying a billionaire. The room laughed until his lawyer stood up. Actually, legally speaking, the one who married up is you, Mr. Pross. 5 minutes later, as financial crimes agents stormed our hall, I just smiled. I had been quietly writing the script for this public execution for 3 years. To the 200 people gathered in the cavernous, crystal-lit ballroom of Cross Heights, I was Claire Monroe Cross, the lucky winner of the matrimonial lottery. I was the small-town girl from Maple Ridge who had somehow stumbled into the golden orbit of a tech visionary. I was 34 years old, wearing a velvet gown that cost more than my father used to make in a year, and I was seated quite deliberately at the edge of the dais, just far enough from the center to be visible, but not important. It was a masterclass in stage management. My mother-in-law, Evelyn Cross, had arranged the seating chart with the precision of a military strategist. My husband, Damien, was the sun around which this entire solar system revolved. His parents, Harold and Evelyn, were the flanking planets, radiating old money and established power. His younger brother, Lobin, and Lobin's new flavor of the month, a socialite named Belle, were the noisy satellites. And then there was me, the decorative moon, the accessory that proved Damien Cross was not only a genius coder and a ruthless businessman, but also a benevolent provider who rescued stray kittens and average women. I took a slow sip of vintage champagne, letting the bubbles burn the back of my throat. It tasted like cold metal and money. Tonight was supposed to be a dual celebration. Ostensibly, we were here to mark 7 years of marriage. In reality, this was the victory lap for Damien's company, Newrigate Labs. They had just closed a Series F funding round that pushed the company valuation past the $1 billion mark. The unicorn status was official. The press was here, lurking behind the velvet ropes with their telephoto lenses, hungry for the image of the perfect American dynasty. From my vantage point, I could see the entire ecosystem of Lakehurst, Westmont, spread out before me. The ballroom was a sea of black tuxedos and designer silk. I saw venture capitalists from Silicon Valley who had flown in on private jets, clapping each other on the back. I saw local politicians who Harold Cross had bought and paid for decades ago. I saw the envy in the eyes of the women and the calculation in the eyes of the men. Damien stood up. The room went silent instantly, a hush bought by power. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal flute, the chime ringing out clear and sharp, cutting through the low hum of conversation. He looked magnificent. I had to give him that. He had the kind of polished, gem-sculpted look that magazines loved, with just enough gray at the temples to suggest wisdom rather than age. He flashed that trademark grin, the one that had disarmed investors and regulators alike for the last decade. "Thank you all for coming," Damon said, his voice booming slightly before he adjusted his pitch to a humble conversational baritone. 7 years. It feels like a lifetime ago that I was sitting in a garage with nothing but a laptop, a coffee maker, and a dream to change how the world processes data. I kept my face perfectly still. A porcelain mask. The garage story. He always loved the garage story. He conveniently left out that the garage was an air-conditioned three-car detached unit on his parents' estate, and the coffee maker was served by a housekeeper. But myths required humble beginnings. Building Newrigate was not a straight line. Damon continued, pacing slightly, commanding the room. There were nights I wanted to quit. There were bugs in the code that seemed impossible to fix. People told me I was reaching too high, that the architecture I envisioned was impossible. He paused for effect. This was the part where he usually mentioned his team. Instead, he pivoted. "But you need a grounding force," he said, turning his gaze toward me. The spotlight swung, blinding me for a second. I blinked, forcing a small practice smile. "You need someone to keep the home fires burning while you go out and hunt the mammoth." A ripple of polite laughter went through the room. Damien walked over to where I was sitting. He didn't offer his hand to help me up. He just placed a hand on my shoulder, a heavy possessive grip that felt less like affection and more like a rancher branding his cattle. "Claire," he said, his voice dripping with performative sentimentality. "My lovely Claire. When I found her, She was working in a cubicle fixing server errors for a mid-tier logistics firm. She didn't know much about the world of high finance or global tech scaling, but she had patience. He looked back at the audience, his grin widening. She really married up, Damien announced. The words hung in the air, suspended in the expensive perfume and conditioned air of the ballroom. I mean, look at this. He gestured around the room, encompassing the chandeliers, the view of the lake, the sheer weight of the wealth surrounding us. She hit the jackpot, didn't she? 7 years ago, she was worrying about student loans. Tonight, she is the wife of a billionaire. It is a true American fairy tale. The room erupted in laughter. It wasn't warm laughter. It was the knowing, cynical laughter of people who understood hierarchies. I saw Belle lean over to Logan, giggling behind her manicured hand. I could read her lips as clearly as if she had shouted. She won the lottery. I saw Evelyn nod approvingly, taking a sip of her wine. This was the narrative she loved, the benevolence of the Cross family, lifting up the unworthy. I sat there, frozen. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but my hands were steady. I looked down at my champagne glass, watching a single bubble rise from the bottom to the surface where it popped and vanished. Married up. The insult wasn't new. I had heard variations of it for 7 years. I had heard it when they forgot to put my name on the door wall for the hospital wing, leaving only Damien's. I had heard it when his friends asked me if I understood the technical talk at dinner parties, unaware that I had written the very security protocols their companies used. I had heard it in the silence that met my own career achievements while Damien's minor victories were celebrated with fireworks. But tonight, hearing it broadcast to 200 people, to the press, to the world, it felt different. It felt like a finality around me. The whispers began, buzzing like flies. She definitely signed a prenup. A man in a velvet blazer muttered to his companion at the table next to mine. Damien is too smart to leave that door open. Cute girl, the companion replied, swirling his drink. But, let's be honest, she is a passenger on this ship. A passenger in first class. Sure, but she is not flying the plane. I breathed in slowly through my nose. I needed to dissociate. I needed to step back from Claire the wife and become Claire the analyst. I visualized my emotions as data streams, isolating the anger, the humiliation, and the rage and routing them into a contained server labeled fuel. I looked across the room, past the blare of the spotlights, toward the VIP tables near the exit. There, sitting alone, was a man in a gray suit that looked decidedly out of fashion compared to the peacock surrounding him. Arthur Lane, Damien's personal attorney. Arthur was not laughing. He was not clapping. He was watching me. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes were sharp, alert. He looked like a man waiting for a train that was exactly 1 minute away from the station. Our eyes met. It was a connection that lasted less than a second, but it carried the weight of 3 years of secret meetings, of encrypted emails, of forensic accounting done in the dead of night, while Damien slept off his expensive scotch. Arthur glanced at his wrist. He checked his watch. Then, very deliberately, he looked toward the double doors at the back of the hall, the service entrance that led to the private study, and the main foyer. He reached up and adjusted his tie, a small subtle movement, the signal. My purse was sitting on the table, a small clutch made of silver mesh. I felt it vibrate against the tablecloth. 1 long pulse, 2 short pulses. My heart rate spiked, threatening to break my composure. I reached out and opened the clutch. Keeping the movement casual, as if I were checking my makeup, I pulled out my phone. The screen was dim. The brightness turned all the way down. There was a single message notification from a contact, listed simply as pizza delivery. It was a burner app secured with military-grade encryption, the kind I used to build for the government before Damien decided my career was a cute hobby. I tapped the screen. The message was decrypted instantly. Asset secured. Federal warrant authorized. The team is inside the perimeter waiting for the lawyer's cue. I locked the phone and slipped it back into the bag. The cold metal mesh felt grounding against my fingertips. Damien was still talking. He was rambling now, high on his own supply of adoration. He was talking about the future, about how Nuragate was going to revolutionize digital privacy, about how he was the guardian of the world's data. "I built this explicitly to protect you," he said, gesturing to the crowd, his voice thick with false nobility. "Because in this family, we lead, we do not follow." He looked back at me, expecting the adoration he felt he was owed. He expected the wet eyes of the grateful Cinderella. He expected the nod of the subservient wife who knew her place was in his shadow. I didn't give it to him. Instead, I picked up my glass again. I looked directly at him, and for the first time in 7 years, I let the mask slip just a fraction. I didn't smile with my mouth. I smiled with my eyes. It was a cold, sharp thing, a look that said, "I know exactly what you are." He faltered just for a microsecond. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, a glitch in his perfect projection. He didn't understand what he was seeing. He thought he was looking at a pet that had suddenly grown wolf teeth. I took a sip, savored the metallic taste, and set the glass down with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence of my own mind. "You think I married up, Damien? You think I am a lucky one? You think you are the protagonist of this story because you stand in the light and talk the loudest." I smoothed the velvet fabric over my knees. The time for being invisible was over. The audit was complete. The vulnerabilities had been exposed. The zero-day exploit was about to be deployed. "If you think I simply married up, my love, you are about to see exactly which direction this marriage has been heading all along. To understand why I sat there holding that glass of champagne like a weapon, you have to understand that hate is not a spark. Hate is a slow accumulation of sediment. It is the dust that settles in the corners of a room that nobody bothers to clean until the air becomes impossible to breathe." My marriage did not start in a mansion on a hill. It started 7 years ago in a cramped, windowless office space that smelled faintly of stale bagels and overheating servers. Back then, Damien was not a billionaire. He was just a founder with dark circles under his eyes and a pitch deck that had been rejected by 30 venture capitalists. And I was not a trophy. I was a lifeline. I was working as a senior security engineer at a firm in Maple Ridge, pulling in a decent salary, paying off my student loans, and living a life that was quiet, logical, and mine. We met at a tech mixer. Damien was charming, frantic, and brilliant in that chaotic way that attracts people who like to fix things. I was a fixer in those early days. He revered my mind. I remember a Tuesday night, about 6 months into our relationship. He was panicking. Nuragate was bleeding data during a stress test, a fatal flaw that would have killed the startup before it even launched. I sat down at his dual monitor setup, pushed his hands away from the keyboard, and spent 5 hours writing his authentication protocols. I found the leak. I patched it. I built a fortress around his code. When I finished, watching the green status light stabilize on the screen, Damien looked at me with something that felt like worship. "You saved me," he had whispered, pulling me into a hug that smelled of cheap coffee and relief. "We are going to do this, Claire. We are going to build the future." We, that was the word that hooked me. But the erosion of we began the moment the first check cleared. It started subtly. When Nuragate finally secured its series of funding, $4 million, that felt like all the money in the world. We went to a celebratory dinner with the investors. I sat beside him, proud, expecting to be introduced as the partner who had secured the back end. Instead, Damien leaned forward, swirling his wine, and told the table about the epiphany he had experienced late one Tuesday night regarding the authentication protocols. He told the story of my code, my fix, and my logic, but he used the pronoun I. I sat there blinking. When I glanced at him, he didn't even look my way. He was basking in the glow of the investors' nods. When he finally introduced me, he squeezed my knee under the table and said, "And this is Claire. She is great with computers. Helps me keep my head on straight. Help me." Like I was an emotional support animal with a laptop. I told myself it was just marketing. I told myself the investors needed to believe in the singular genius of the founder. It was business. I swallowed the slight, and that was the first layer of sediment. Then came the Cross family. Marrying Damien meant marrying into a dynasty that viewed people like asset classes to Harold and Evelyn Cross. I was a curiosity. I was middle class. I went to a state university, and I worked a job where I got my hands dirty with code. I wasn't from their world of country clubs and generational trust funds, but they accepted me not as a daughter, but as a rehabilitation project. She is presentable. I once heard Evelyn whisper to a friend in the sunroom, unaware I was just around the corner, smart enough not to embarrass him and pretty enough to soften his edges. Damon needs someone grounded. It looks good for the shareholders. The weekly dinners at the Cross estate became a ritual of humiliation. The dining table was a mahogany battlefield where worth measured in headlines. Damien Harold would boom from the head of the table, cutting into his steak. I saw the projection for the third quarter. 15% growth. Outstanding. The way you leveraged that acquisition was pure strategy, a Harvard case study in the making. They would spend 40 minutes dissecting Damien's genius. Then, during the lull before dessert, Evelyn would offer me a token question like throwing a scrap to a dog. "And how is your little job going, Claire?" "Still working with those firewalls. I was actually promoted to Chief Information Security Officer last week," I said one evening, keeping my voice steady. "I am leading the contract negotiations with the government for Sentinel Apex systems. We are securing federal databases." "That is nice, dear," Evelyn said, already turning away to signal the maid for coffee. "It is good to stay busy." Busy, as if I were knitting scarves for charity rather than managing cyber security for critical infrastructure. The real breaking point, the moment the invisible wall became impenetrable, happened 2 years ago. I came home with the news of a massive bonus, a payout from Sentinel Apex that put my annual income into the top 1% of earners in the country. It was significant money. It was validation. I walked into our living room excited to share this with the man who had once called me his savior. "Damien," I said, "I closed the deal. Sentinel Apex gave me the performance bonus. It is nearly $200,000. Damien didn't congratulate me. He didn't pop champagne. He looked up from his tablet, his eyes lighting up with calculation, not pride. "That is perfect timing," he said. "We need a bridge loan to cover the marketing spend for the new rollout. You can inject that capital into Newrigate. We will mark it as a founder contribution." I froze. "This is my work, Damien. This is my career." "It is all the same pot, Claire," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "My success is your success. Newrigate is the legacy. Your job is, well, it is a great safety net. But let us be real. The real value is here." There it was, the patent. My achievements were simply raw materials for him to consume. My intelligence was a natural resource he felt entitled to. And conversely, whenever something went wrong at home, a dinner party that ran late, a bill he forgot to pay, it was labeled a CLA problem. I began to notice the small cuts, the way the seating cards at Gallers would list him as Mr. Damon Cross, CEO, and me simply as guest. The local magazine did a profile on Lakehurst's power couples, and the caption under our photo reads, "Tech mogul and wife." They didn't even print my name. When I pointed it out to Evelyn, she laughed, a tinkling, brittle sound. "Oh, stop being so sensitive. Darling, you are the classic example of a woman who is elevated by her husband. You should be grateful he shines so bright. It lights up your little corner of the world." My little corner. I stopped arguing. I stopped trying to correct the record at dinner parties. Instead, I engaged the part of my brain that I used at Sentinel Apex. I became an auditor. I started watching my marriage the way I watched a compromised network. I logged every condescending remark. I tracked every time he volunteered my time or my money without asking. I noted the way he spoke about me to his friends as a lucky accessory, a good girl who knew her place. I realized that to Damien and his family, I was an NPC, a non-player character in the video game of his life. I was there to provide dialogue, fill the background, and support the hero's journey. I had no agency. I had no inventory. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. It wasn't just anger. It was a survival instinct. I realized that if I stayed on this trajectory, I would wake up at 50 years old with nothing, no name, no money that was truly mine, no credit for the intellect that had built the foundation of his empire. I needed an exit strategy, but more than that, I needed a fortress. I looked at Damien one night as he slept, his arm thrown carelessly over his eyes, murmuring about stock options in his sleep. "You think you own everything," I whispered into the dark. I decided then that I needed something that did not bear the name Cross. I needed a project that was invisible to his greed. I needed to build a backdoor into my own life. The idea for the framework, the code that would eventually become the weapon at his throat, did not come from a desire to destroy him. Not yet. It came from a desperate need to exist. I went to work the next day at Sentinel Apex, sat down at my terminal, and opened a new blank file. I didn't name it Revenge. I named it Monroe Defense. And for the first time in 7 years, I felt like I was breathing my own air. The architecture of my revenge did not begin with a lawyer or a private investigator. It began with a line of Python code. In my world, the digital world, there is a concept called a zero-day exploit. It is a vulnerability in software that is unknown to the vendor, a hole in the wall that no one knows exists except the person who found it until the vendor discovers it. They have 0 days to fix it. I realized that my marriage to Damien was a massive sprawling system full of vulnerabilities, but I lacked the route access to exploit them. I needed a tool. I needed a weapon that looked like a shield. It started at my day job at Sentinel Apex Systems. I had been working late nights on a heuristic analysis engine, a piece of software designed not just to stop cyber attacks, but to predict them. I called it the Chimera framework. Unlike standard firewalls that look for known threats, Chimera used machine learning to study the breadth of a network. It learned what normal looked like, so it could instantly decapitate anything that moved strangely. It was brilliant. It was elegant. And my superiors at Sentinel Apex completely missed the point. I remember the meeting with the board of directors. I stood in front of a whiteboard covered in flowcharts, explaining how Chimera could revolutionize federal data security. The CEO, a man who still typed with 2 fingers, looked at me and yawned. "It is impressive, Claire," he said, checking his watch, "but it sounds expensive to maintain. Let us just package a light version and license it to our mid-tier retail clients. Quick cash flow." I felt a cold snap in my chest. They were going to take a Ferrari engine and put it in a lawn mower. That same evening, I came home to Cross Heights. Damien was pacing the living room, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. He was in fundraising mode, which meant he was manic and demanding. "I need a hook, Claire," he said, not even saying hello. "The Series C investors are hesitating. They say Newrigate is just another data aggregator. I need something proprietary, something sexy, a security layer that nobody else has." He stopped pacing and looked at me. The look was predatory. "You have been working on that predictive thing, right? That Chimera project." I stiffened. I had mentioned it once in passing 3 months ago. He never listened to my work stories, but apparently he archived anything he could steal. "It is complex, Damien," I said carefully. "It is not something you can just plug into Newrigate." "You can make it fit," he said, waving his hand as if dismissing gravity. "Just write the kernel for me. We will brand it as NeuroShield. I will give you a shout-out in the press release. Maybe buy you that Tesla you wanted." There it was, the patent. He wanted to take my brain, my months of sleepless nights, and slap his label on it. He would stand on a stage and tell the world he revolutionized security, and I would get a car and a pat on the head. If I gave him Chimera, I would lose the last thing that was truly mine. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my home office, the small one in the guest wing that Damien rarely entered, and I made a decision. I was not going to give Chimera to Sentinel Apex to ruin, and I was certainly not going to give it to Damien to steal. I was going to keep it. The next morning, I called in sick. I drove 3 hours across the state line to a nondescript office building in a strip mall. I met with a lawyer who specialized in corporate anonymity. By 4 in the afternoon, Monroe Defense Analytics LLC was born. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic camouflage. The company was registered in Delaware. The name on the registration was not Claire Cross. It was not even Claire Monroe. It was a blind trust managed by a proxy board. On paper, Monroe Defense was a faceless entity. In reality, I was the sole beneficial owner. I returned to Sentinel Apex with a counter-proposal. I told them that the Chimera framework was too complex to be developed in-house under their current budget constraints. I suggested that I spin it off as an independent project, finish the development on my own time and my own dime, and then license the finished product back to them as a third-party vendor. They agreed. To them, it looked like they were offloading risks. They didn't have to pay for the RD. They just paid for the license if it worked. I went home and told Damien, I can't give you the code, honey. Sentinel locked it down. Corporate policy. He pouted for 2 days, called me selfish, and then moved on to harassing his marketing team. He never asked again. He assumed that because he couldn't serve it, it wasn't worth having. 6 months later, the beast woke up. I have finished the code. Monroe Defense Analytics formally licensed the Chimera framework to Sentinel Apex. But then something happened that shifted the ground beneath my feet. The Federal Critical Systems Bureau, the FCSB, flagged the software. They had been auditing Sentinel's new security protocols for a government contract, and their engineers saw Chimera in action. They saw how it caught a state-sponsored intrusion attempt that 3 other major firewalls had missed. I received an email on my encrypted private server. It was not from Sentinel. It was from a Gov address. They wanted to talk to the architects of Monroe Defense. I hired a professional actor, a retired corporate lawyer named Mr. Sterling, to act as the face of Monroe for the initial video calls. I sat in the room off-camera typing responses for him to say in real time. The government didn't just want to license Chimera. They wanted to classify it. They designated the framework as a national security asset. The contract they sent over was thick enough to stop a bullet. The licensing fee was not just a salary. It was wealth. It was the kind of money that buys islands. It was the kind of money Damien pretended to have, but actually owed to banks. I signed the documents as the authorized signatory of the trust. The first wire transfer hit the Monroe Defense offshore account on a rainy Tuesday in November. I looked at the screen. $4 million. And that was just the quarterly retainer. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store, staring at the number on my phone. My hands were shaking. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just safe. I was powerful. I went home that night and made dinner. Damien came in late complaining about the cost of jet fuel for his private plane. Money is tight this quarter, he grumbled, loosening his tie. I might need you to cut back on the household expenses. Claire, maybe fire the second gardener. You can do some of the landscaping on weekends, right? It is good exercise. I looked at him. I looked at this man who thought he held the purse strings of the universe. He had no idea that the woman cutting his carrots had a bank balance that could buy his detergent company twice over. Sure, Damien, I said, my voice smooth and calm. I can pick up some extra work. I have a little side project I'm tinkering with. He laughed. It was a short, barking sound. That little coding thing, what do you call it? Monroe Defense. Kid, maybe you will make enough to pay for your own manicures. Every little bit helps. Right, I said, every little bit. He didn't know that Monroe Defense was now the primary gatekeeper for the power grid of the eastern seaboard. He didn't know that the side hustle was a defense contractor with federal clearance. He saw a wife with a hobby. I saw a ghost in the machine. I went to bed that night and lay awake, listening to his breathing. I visualized the database of Monroe Defense. I visualized the encrypted keys that only I possessed. It was a secret room in a house he thought he owned completely. For 7 years, Damien had taken credit for my light, but he had forgotten to check the shadows. And in the shadows, I had built an empire. I rolled over and closed my eyes. The revenge wasn't just about money. It was about ownership. For the first time, I owned something he couldn't touch. I owned something he couldn't rename. And the best part, the government of the United States had just handed me a shield. If Damien ever tried to come for my assets now, he wouldn't just be fighting his wife, he would be fighting the Department of Defense. I slept better that night than I had in a decade. The trap was not just set. It was federally subsidized. The explosion did not happen with a bang. It happened with the rustle of paper. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the first federal wire transfer hit my secret account. The house was quiet, the kind of heavy, expensive silence that only exists in mansions where the walls are thick enough to muffle a scream. I was in the breakfast nook, drinking black coffee and reading a briefing on encryption standards for the grid. When Damien stormed in, he did not walk. He marched. His face was a shade of red I had never seen before, a mottled crimson that clashed with his silk robe. In his hand, he clutched a sheath of papers. "What is this?" he demanded, slamming the documents onto the marble table so hard my coffee cup rattled in its saucer. I looked down. It was a draft of our joint tax return. The family accountant, a man named Mr. Henderson, who usually knew better than to bother Damien with details, must have sent the wrong attachment. Or perhaps Damien, in a fit of paranoia induced by his falling stock prices, had actually decided to read what he was signing. There, highlighted an angry yellow marker by Damien's own hand, was a single-line item under passive income. External entities, Monroe Defense Analytics, LLC, decided was a number. It wasn't the full millions that was sheltered in the corporate accounts, but it was the pass-through income I had legally declared to keep the IRS off my back. $350,000. It looks like a tax return. "Damien," I said, keeping my voice level. My heart kicked against my ribs, but I forced my hands to remain steady as I reached for my mug. "Do not play dumb with me, Claire," he spat. "I know what a tax return is. I want to know what the hell Monroe Defense is. And I want to know why my wife has a company I have never heard of that is pulling in 300 grand a quarter." He leaned over the table, looming over me. "Is this money from that little side hustle, the consulting thing?" "It is," I said. "I told you I was taking on extra work." "Extra work." He laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You do not make this kind of money fixing firewalls for local banks, Claire. This is real capital, and you hid it. You hid it from me." He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled out his phone and hit a speed dial number. I knew exactly who was on the other end. "Mother," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "You and Dad need to come over now. We have a situation with Claire." Yes, financial infidelity. An hour later, I was sitting in the main drawing room of Cross Heights. It was a room designed to intimidate, filled with uncomfortable antique chairs and portraits of Damien's ancestors, or people he claimed were ancestors staring down with judgmental eyes. It felt less like a family meeting and more like a court-martial. Harold Cross sat in the wing-back chair, his fingers steeped together. Evelyn perched on the sofa next to Damien, her hand resting protectively on his knee. I sat on the ottoman lower than everyone else. A deliberate choice by Evelyn. "Claire, darling," Evelyn began. Her voice was sweet, like syrup poured over broken glass. "We are all very confused. Damien tells us you have been operating a shadow business." "It is not a shadow business, Evelyn," I said. "It is a limited liability company. It is a standard structure for independent contractors. I set it up to handle my consulting fees for Sentinel Apex." "Consulting fees?" Harold rumbled. He sounded like a disappointed headmaster. $350,000 is not a consulting fee. Young lady, that is a revenue stream, and in this family, we believe in transparency. Total transparency. I did not realize I needed permission to earn a living, I said. Damien shot up from the sofa. He began to pace the length of the Persian rug, his hands flying in the air. "That is not the point," he shouted. "The point is that you are my wife. You live in my house. You eat my food. You drive the car I leased. And meanwhile, you are stashing money away in some secret account under your maiden name, Monroe. Really, you dropped the Cross name for this." "It is my legal name, Damien," I said. "It is a slap in the face," he countered. "I have carried you for 7 years. I have introduced you to the elite. I have given you a lifestyle that girls from Maple Ridge only dream about. And this is how you repay me, by hoarding cash like a squirrel, while my company, Our Future, is fighting for liquidity." He stopped in front of me, pointing a finger at my face. "I needed that capital, Claire. Newrigate needed that capital. If I had known you were sitting on this kind of cash, we could have avoided the bridge loan. We could have hired better developers. You let me stress over peril while you were sitting on a pile of gold. It is not liquid cash, Damien. I lied smoothly. It is tied up in operational costs and retained earnings. Bull, he said. This is serious, Claire, Harold interjected, his voice grave. Hiding assets from a spouse can be construed as fraud. In a divorce court, this would look very ugly. The threat hung in the air. Divorce. They were weaponizing the one thing they thought I was terrified of losing. Evelyn sighed, smoothing her skirt. We do not want it to come to that. Of course, we are a family, but family means sharing burdens and boons. You signed a prenuptial agreement. Claire, you remember that. Did you not? I remember. I said, then you know that the spirit of that agreement was to protect the family estate. Evelyn said, technically any intellectual property created during the marriage could be argued as community property, especially since he used the resources, the home, the internet, the stability provided by Damien to create it. I almost laughed. They were claiming my code belonged to them because I wrote it while sitting in a house Damien owned. Actually, I said, and this was the moment I had to be very, very careful. The framework for Monroe defense is based on algorithms I wrote in graduate school before we met, before the marriage. The company is simply a vehicle for licensing that pre-existing intellectual property legally under the separate property clause of the very prenup you made me sign. It is untouchable. The room went silent. I saw Arthur Lane's handiwork in their hesitation. The prenup was ironclad, written to protect Damien's premarital assets from me. But in their arrogance, they had made the language symmetrical. What was mine before was mine forever. Harold frowned. He knew I was right, or at least that I sounded right enough to make a lawsuit expensive. Legal technicalities aside, Harold said, shifting tactics to moral shaming. There is the matter of trust. How can Damien trust you when you keep secrets? A wife does not build a fortress against her husband unless she is planning to leave him. Damien looked at me, his eyes wide with a mix of hurt and fury. He played the victim so well he almost believed it himself. Is that it? He asked, his voice cracking theatrically. Are you planning an exit strategy, Claire? After everything I have done for you, I lifted you out of obscurity. I gave you a name that opens doors, and you are hiding money. I am not planning anything, Damien. I said, I just wanted something of my own. You have Newrigate. You have the estate. You have the fame. I just wanted security. You have security. He yelled. I am your security. Evelyn stood up and walked over to the sidebar. She poured a glass of water and brought it to me. It was a gesture of dominance, not care. Listen to me, Claire, she said softly. We can fix this. We can put this ugliness behind us, but you need to prove your loyalty. If this company, this Monroe Defense, is really just a little side project, then you should have no problem bringing it into the fold. She placed the water in my hand and smiled. We want you to transfer the assets of Monroe Defense into the cross-family trust. We will manage it. Harold's team will handle the taxes, the licensing, the legal work. We will optimize it. It will still be yours technically, but it will be safe under the family umbrella. It is the only way to restore Damien's trust. I looked at the three of them, the father, the mother, the son, a free-headed hydra of greed. They didn't just want my money. They wanted to digest me. They wanted to dissolve the last solid thing I had until I was nothing more than a nutrient for their ego. If I said no now, they would declare war. They would lock me out of accounts, fire my staff, perhaps even try to sue me before I was ready to strike. I needed time. I needed to get to Washington. I lowered my eyes. I let my shoulders slump, mimicking the posture of the defeated wife they expected me to be. I do not know, I stammered. It is complicated. There are government contracts involved. We handle government contracts all the time, Harold said dismissively. I want to make this right, I whispered. I do not want to fight with you, Damien. I hate it when we fight. Damien's chest puffed out. He saw the surrender. He saw the weakness. Then do the right thing, Claire, he said. Sign it over. Let us manage it. Show me that you are actually in this marriage. I took a deep breath, letting it shudder out of me. Okay, I said. Okay, but I cannot just sign a napkin. It is a federal entity. I need to have my lawyer draft the transfer documents, to make sure we do not trigger an audit. I need to do it properly. Oh, is your lawyer? Harold asked sharply. Just a freelancer I hired to set up the LLC. I lied. I will tell him to draw up the papers, to merge Monroe Defense into the Cross Trust. I will get him to send everything over next week. Make it this week, Damon said. I will try. I said, but I have to go to Washington for a few days. The government needs me on site for a compliance check. I can drop the papers off with the lawyer on my way. Damien looked at Evelyn. Evelyn nodded. They thought they had won. They thought they had bullied the mouse into giving up the cheese. Fine, Damon said. Go to Washington. Do your little compliance check. But when you come back, I want those papers signed. And Claire, he leaned in close, invading my personal space. No more secrets. You are a cross. Act like it. I said. The meeting broke up. Harold and Evelyn left, satisfied that order had been restored to the universe. Damien went into his office to pour himself a celebratory drink, probably to toast his own negotiating skills. I walked out to the balcony that overlooked the infinity pool. The sun was setting over Lakehurst, turning the water into a sheet of blood-orange fire. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from adrenaline. I had just bought myself a window, a narrow, fragile window. I heard the sliding glass door open down the hall. Damien's office. He was on the phone. His voice carried clearly in the evening air. He was talking to Logan. Yeah, she folded. Damon bragged, his voice loud and arrogant. I had to put the fear of God into her, but she caved. She is signing the company over to the trust next week. It is a nice little cash cow. Actually, government contracts, easy money. I am going to use it to leverage the Hellart deal. He laughed, the sound of a man who believes he is the king of the jungle. She really thought she could outsmart us. Logan, can you believe that? But you know Claire, she needs to be led. I always know how to control the narrative. I gripped the railing of the balcony. The metal was cold against my palms. Control, I whispered to the wind. He thought he had just acquired a new asset. He didn't realize he had just authorized his own destruction. By demanding I merge Monroe Defense into the trust, he had given me the perfect excuse to involve Arthur Lane. He had given me the mandate to restructure everything. We will see who controls who. Damien, I said into the darkness. We will see. I turned back toward the house. I had a bag to pack. I had a plane to catch. And I had a spring trap to spring. The summons from the Federal Critical Systems Bureau came 3 days after the disastrous family meeting. To Damien, it looked like the nuisance of bureaucratic interruption to his social calendar. To me, it was an extraction team. The project was named Iron Grid. The objective was to secure the electrical infrastructure of the eastern seaboard against state-sponsored cyber warfare. Because my framework, the Chimera engine, was the backbone of this new defense protocol, my physical presence was required. I was not just being asked to consult. I was being deployed. I packed my bags with a sense of clinical detachment. I was leaving Lacuist, leaving the suffocating perfume of the Cross Mansion and heading into a world of concrete, clearance badges, and non-disclosure agreements. I was trading a golden cage for a bunker, and I had never been more relieved. The facility was located in Redford, a fictional jurisdiction that existed mostly on topographic maps and government ledgers. It was a 3-hour flight from our home, but it might as well have been on Mars. My first morning there set the tone for everything that would follow. I sat in a windowless briefing room with agent Marcus Hale. Hale was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and left out in the rain hard, eroded, and utterly humorless. He did not care about stock prices or gallows. He cared about national security. He slid a document across the steel table. It was stamped with red ink. Restricted Asset Class 1. This is Cross, Agent Hale said, his voice a low rumble. I need you to understand the specific legal standing of the code you have licensed to us through Monroe Defense Analytics. I am listening, I said. This is no longer just proprietary software, Hale explained, tapping the paper with a thick finger. As of 800 hours yesterday, the Chimera framework has been designated a critical defense asset. That means its ownership, Distribution and access are regulated under the same statutes that cover missile guidance systems. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. If anyone attempts to transfer, sell, or license this code to an unauthorized entity, especially a foreign-owned entity, without explicit federal approval, it is not a civil tort. It is a federal felony. It is treason adjacent. I felt a shiver run down my spine. This was the lock. Does my husband have any rights to this? I asked, needing to hear him say it. Hale glanced at his file. Damien Cross number. The contract is with Monroe Defense. You are the sole signatory, unless Mr. Cross has a top-secret clearance and a place on your board of directors. He is a civilian. If he tries to sell this as part of his company's portfolio, he is committing fraud against the United States government. I picked up the pen and signed the acknowledgement. Understood. I had just weaponized the federal government against my own marriage before I had left Lakehurst. I had planted the seeds for this very trap. I knew Damien never read anything that did not have his name in the headline. So I had prepared a binder. It was thick, boring, and titled Financial Operations and Asset Separation Guidelines During Absence. I had walked into his home office the morning of my flight. He was on the phone yelling at a supplier about microchip shortages. I am leaving this for you, I had said, placing the binder on his desk. It details the operational boundaries of Monroe Defense while I am gone. Specifically, page 4. It states clearly that Monroe assets are federal property and cannot be used as collateral for any loans or merged into Newrigate. Damien had covered the mouthpiece of the phone, rolling his eyes. Jesus, Claire, you are going away for a few months, not dying. Stop being so dramatic. Just read page 4. Damien, please. Yeah, page 4. Got it. Have a safe flight. He had waved me away like a fly as I walked out the door. I glanced back. He had already put his coffee mug on top of the binder. Using my warning as a coaster, he had been warned. He had been informed. His negligence was now a matter of record. The weeks in Washington were grueling. I worked 18 hours a day scrubbing code, running simulations, and sitting in meetings with people who spoke in acronyms. But in the quiet moments in the lonely hotel room overlooking the TOEIC, I was building the second half of the trap. It was during lunch with a compliance officer that I learned about the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. They scrutinized any deal where a foreign company bought an American tech asset. If Newrigate tried to sell itself to a global conglomerate like, say, Heliarch Global, and claimed to own a piece of classified defense software like Chimera, the deal would not just be blocked, it would trigger an immediate investigation into everyone involved. I smiled into my salad. Damien was so desperate for cash, he was undoubtedly looking overseas. He was walking blindfolded into a minefield, but I needed eyes on the ground in Lakehurst. I needed someone inside the house. I made a phone call to the one person who knew where the bodies were buried because he had been forced to dig the graves. Arthur Lane met me at a dive bar in Georgetown, far away from the prying eyes of the tech world. He looked tired. The crisp suit he wore at the party was replaced by a rumpled raincoat. He looked like a man who had spent too many years cleaning up messes he didn't make. You are playing a dangerous game, Claire, Arthur said, nursing a burden. Damien is erratic. Harold is vindictive. If they find out you are meeting me, they won't, I said. Because you are tired, Arthur. I can see it. You are tired of drafting NDAs for Damien's mistresses. You are tired of Harold asking you to find creative ways to hide income. You are a good lawyer stuck in a bad family. Arthur sighed, looking down into his glass. I have a retainer, attorney-client privilege. Privilege ends where crime begins, I said softly. And we both know Damien is crossing lines he does not even see. I slid a folder across the table. It contained the FCSB designation of my software. If Damien tries to sell Newrigate with my tech included, he goes down for federal fraud. If you are his counsel of record when he does it, you go down with him, or you can help me steer him away from the cliff, or at least make sure you are not in the car when it crashes. Arthur read the document. His face palled. He realized instantly the magnitude of the exposure. What do you want? He asked. I want to see the trust documents, I said. The real ones, not the versions he shows me. Arthur hesitated for a long moment. Then, with the air of a man stepping off a ledge, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. You did not get this from me. We spent the next 2 hours dissecting the Cross family trust. What I found made my blood run cold, then boil. Damien hadn't just been pressuring me to sign over Monroe Defense. He had already begun the paperwork to absorb it. He had drafted addendums that listed anticipated assets, including my company. But worse, he had altered the terms of our original prenup in the bank's digital vault. He had forged my digital signature on a waiver of spousal consent, allowing him to leverage our joint stock portfolio to cover his personal gambling debts, crypto gambling debts. He is reckless, Arthur muttered, shaking his head. I told him he could not just edit a PDF and call it legal binding, but he thinks he is above the law. He hanged himself, I said, staring at the forged signature. This is it, Arthur. This is the proof. He is trying to steal a federal asset, and he is forging documents to do it. I looked at the lawyer. I need you to let him do it. Arthur looked up, startled. What if we stop him now? It is just a domestic dispute, I explained, my voice hard. He gets a slap on the wrist. I want him to sign the deal with Hellark. I want him to stand on a stage and claim he owns my work. I want him to commit to the lie so completely that there is no way back. You want to entrap him, Arthur said. No, I want to stop interrupting him while he makes a mistake. There is a difference. Arthur took a long sip of his bourbon. He looked at me with a new kind of respect mixed with a healthy dose of fear. You are not the woman he married, Arthur said. No, I replied. I am the woman he made. We struck a deal. Arthur would remain in place. He would advise Damien, but he would not stop him from pursuing the acquisition deal with Hellark Global. In fact, he would ensure the paperwork was drawn up exactly as Damien wanted, full of lies and stolen assets. But he would keep a pristine paper trail showing that he had advised against it. He would protect himself, and in doing so, he would hand me the smoking gun. He thinks I am in Washington drowning in work, I told Arthur as we stood up to leave. He thinks I am neglecting him. He thinks I am a distracted, absent wife who doesn't care about his needs. He is complaining about it to everyone who will listen, Arthur confirmed. He says you have abandoned your duties. Good, I said, buttoning my coat against the cold D.C. wind. Let him feel abandoned. Let him feel justified. The more he thinks he is the victim, the more greedy he will become. He will try to take everything because he thinks he has owed it. I walked out of the bar and into the night. The Washington Monument glowed in the distance, a sharp needle against the sky. I felt a strange kinship with it, cold, sharp, and watching. I had my federal protection. I had my inside man. Now all I had to do was wait for my husband to decide he was smart enough to sell something that could send him to prison for 20 years. I checked my phone. A text from Damien. Where is the login for the Monroe bank account? I need to check something for the accountant. He hadn't even waited a month. I didn't reply. I let the silence sit there. Let him get angry. Let him break the lock. I wanted his fingerprints on everything. Distance is a clarifier. From 300 m away in a sterilized hotel suite in Washington, the noise of my marriage faded, leaving only the signal. And the signal was screaming that I was being erased. For the first few weeks, Damien kept up the charade. He would FaceTime me late at night, his face washed out by the blue light of his phone, holding a glass of scotch. The house is empty without you, babe. He would slur slightly. It is just quiet. When are you coming back? The gardeners are slacking off. Soon, I would say, sitting at a desk covered in classified schematics. The government moves slowly, you know that. Yeah, well, paria. I have big things happening. Big things. But by week 4, the calls stopped coming. When I called him, he would answer with the camera pointed at the ceiling or the floor. The background noise, a thumping bass of a party I wasn't invited to. Can't talk. He would shout over the noise. Entertaining investors. Bought to go. Click. I didn't need him to tell me who the investors were. I had Instagram. Social media is the world's most efficient surveillance tool if you know who to follow. I didn't follow Damien's official account that was managed by a PR firm. I followed the people around him. Specifically, I followed Belle, Logan's girlfriend. Belle was 23, an influencer whose primary talent seemed to be wearing bikinis in inappropriate weather. Her feed became a storyboard of my humiliation. There was a photo of a dinner at El Jardin, the most expensive restaurant in Lakehurst. Damien was at the head of the table. I was not there, but Belle was standing next to his chair, her hand resting casually on his shoulder, leaning in to whisper something. Caption: Power moves with the big boys tonight. Family empire billionaire mindset. Then came the club photos. Damien holding a bottle of Dom Perignon, looking sweaty and euphoric. Belle dancing in the foreground. Logan was somewhere in the back, blurry and irrelevant. The geometry of the photos had shifted. Damien and Belle were the center. I was not even a ghost. I was a deleted file. A financial tabloid picked it up a week later. I saw the notification pop up on my tablet while I was waiting for a security clearance badge at the FCSB headquarters. Headline: Tech mogul Damien Cross steps out with mystery blonde. Is the Monroe era over? The article speculated that my absence was a trial separation and that Damien was moving on with a younger, more vibrant companion. They didn't name Belle, simply calling her a social media model. I didn't cry. I didn't throw away my phone. I zoomed in on the photo. I noticed Damon's pupils were dilated. I noticed the desperation in his smile. He looked like a man running from something. Then came the email from Evelyn. It arrived at 2 in the morning, flagged as high priority. The subject line was simply "Concern Claire." It read, "I am writing this because I love you and I want you to face reality. You have been gone for 2 months. A man like Damien has needs. He has an image to maintain. You cannot prioritize your little government job over the dynasty we are building. If you leave a seat empty at the table, do not be surprised if someone else sits in it. There are hundreds of girls who would kill to be Mrs. Pross. Come home and fix this or accept the consequences." I archived the email. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I had moved past the emotional audit and into the forensic one. While Evelyn was attacking my character, my network of informants was feeding me the data that actually mattered. A friend from my undergraduate days, now a senior risk analyst at the bank Newrigate used, sent me a message via an encrypted chat app. He is bleeding. Claire, he just mortgaged another 15% of his personal equity in Newrigate. And the destination account. It is a crypto fund based in the Cayman Islands. It looks like a Ponzi scheme. He is throwing good money after bad. He is desperate for liquidity. I stared at the screen. Damien was gambling the company assets on volatile coins because the operational revenue wasn't there. He was insolvent. But the real smoking gun came from Arthur Lane. We had established a dead drop system. He wouldn't email me directly. He would upload draft documents to a shared secure cloud folder that we pretended was for estate planning. I opened the folder one rainy Tuesday night. There was a new file, Project Helios Acquisition Term Sheet. I opened it. Project Helios was the code name for the sale of Newrigate to Helarc Global. The purchase price was staggering $1.2 billion. I scrolled down to the intellectual property schedule. This was the section where the seller lists everything they own to justify the price. There it was. Item 4, the Neuros Shield Core architecture, including all source code, machine learning algorithms, and predictive security protocols. Damien had listed my framework. He had listed the Chimera engine. He had explicitly warranted in the contract that Newrigate owned this technology free and clear of any third-party claims. He had not mentioned Monroe Defense. He had not mentioned the federal license. He was selling a stolen car to a foreign buyer, and the car happened to belong to the U.S. military. My phone buzzed. It was Arthur. He sent the draft to Helarc this morning, Arthur said, his voice tight. He is pushing for a closing date in 3 weeks. He wants to announce it at the anniversary party. Did you advise him against it? I asked. I wrote a memo, Arthur said. I told him that the ownership chain of the security layer was ambiguous and recommended a full audit. He tore it up in front of me. He said, I paid for the house she wrote it in. I own the code. He told me to draft the sale agreement as is. Perfect, I said. Let him proceed. Claire, this is fraud, Arthur whispered. If he signs this, he is finished, I corrected. Do not stop him, Arthur. Let him dig the hole. Just make sure your name isn't on the shovel. I hung up. I took the draft contract, the one with Damien's digital notes in the margins, urging the lawyers to speed it up, and I attached it to a new email. Recipient Internal Investigations Division, SEC, CC Agent Marcus Hale, SCSB. Subject potential violation of asset control protocols, material misrepresentation to investors. I hit send. It felt like pulling a trigger, but Damien wasn't done. He had one more insult to throw at me, one more attempt to erase my existence. A notification from the bank alerted me to a change in the family trust structure. Damien had logged in using his administrator credentials. I logged in with my view-only access to see what he had done. He had removed me as the primary beneficiary of the life insurance policies. He had changed the terms of the spousal support clause, inserting a new stipulation: the abandonment of the marital home for more than 60 days constituted a forfeit of assets. He was trying to edit me out of his life, financially, before he kicked me out physically. But, in his arrogance, he had made a fatal error. He had made these changes from his laptop at the Newrigate office. Timestamp showed he did it at 3:00 in the afternoon, at the exact same time. He was supposedly in a board meeting claiming that the trust was irrevocable and unchangeable to a creditor. He had just created a digital paper trail proving he controlled the trust for his own benefit, piercing the corporate veil he relied on for protection. I sat in that hotel room, the glow of the laptop illuminating my face. I read the logs. I read the emails. I looked at the photo of him laughing with Belle. A normal wife would be screaming. A normal wife would be flying home to confront him. I took a sip of lukewarm hotel water. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. "You poor fool," I whispered to the screen. Damien thought he was playing a game of chess. He thought he was capturing a pawn. He didn't realize he was playing against a grandmaster who had already rigged the board with explosives. He had just upgraded himself. He was no longer just a bad husband. He was no longer just a cheating narcissist. "Congratulations, Damien," I said, closing the laptop. "You just promoted yourself to a federal criminal." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city of lawns. "And I am going to be the one who slams the cell door shut." The fatal mistake of the narcissist is the belief that everyone else is an extra in their movie. Damien believed this so implicitly that when the legal team from Helight Global demanded a due diligence meeting with Monroe Defense Analytics to clear the intellectual property chain of title, Damon didn't even bother to attend. He was too busy picking out the vintage of champagne for the victory party. "Just handle it, Arthur," Damon had said, waving a hand dismissively as he examined a silk tie in the mirror. "It is just a formality. Monroe is a shell company. Just get their representative to sign the waiver saying Newrigate owns the rights. Throw them $5,000 if you have to. I do not care. Just get the signature." He assumed Monroe Defense was run by some low-level administrator I had hired. He assumed Arthur Lane could bully them into submission. He had no idea that he was sending his lawyer to meet with his wife. The meeting took place in Kingsford City, in a glass-walled conference room on the 45th floor of the Hellark Tower. The view was breathtaking, a sprawl of steel and ambition, but the atmosphere inside the room was frigid. 3 attorneys from Hellark sat on one side of the mahogany table. They were sharks in $3,000 suits, looking impatient. Arthur sat opposite them, looking intentionally harried and nervous, playing the part of the overwhelmed lawyer perfectly. "Mr. Lane, the lead counsel for Haley, a sharp-eyed woman named MS. Sterling said, we cannot proceed with a $1.2 billion acquisition until we have absolute clarity. The Newrigate source code references libraries owned by Monroe Defense. Your client claims he owns them. The documentation says otherwise. Where is the representative from Monroe?" "She is on her way," Arthur said, checking his watch. "She is a very private individual. We do not have time for privacy," Miss Sterling snapped. "If this IP isn't cleared by noon, the deal is dead." The heavy oak doors opened. I walked in. I was not wearing the pastel sundresses Damien liked. I was not wearing the soft, subservient fabrics of the trophy wife. I was wearing a tailored black suit that looked like armor. My hair was pulled back tight. I carried a briefcase, not a purse. The room went silent. MS. Sterling looked confused. She looked at me, then at Arthur. Mrs. Crossed, she asked, her tone shifting from aggression to bewilderment. I did not realize you were joining us. Is your husband running late? I didn't answer immediately. I walked to the head of the table, the seat usually reserved for the CEO, and placed my briefcase down with a heavy thud. My husband is not coming, I said. My voice was different. It wasn't the soft, accommodating voice I used in Lakest. It was the voice I used in Washington. And I am not here as Mrs. Pruss. I opened the briefcase and slid a single document across the table. It was the Articles of Incorporation for Monroe Defense Analytics, LLC. I am the founder, the CEO, and the sole shareholder of Monroe Defense, I said. And, gentlemen, MS. Sterling, you are currently negotiating to buy stolen goods. MS. Sterling picked up the document. Her eyes scanned it, widening with every line. She looked at Arthur. Did you know about this? She demanded. Arthur put on a masterclass performance. He stood up, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. I had no idea. Damien told me he said it was a third-party vendor. Sit down, Arthur, I said coolly. You are just the messenger. I turned my attention back to the Hellark team. They were no longer looking at me as a socialite. They were looking at me as a threat. Here is the situation, I said, sliding a second folder across the table. My husband, Damien Cross, has represented to you that Neurogate Labs owns the Neuro's Shield security layer. That is a lie. Neurogate has a limited auto-transferable license to use the software. They do not own the code. I do. I paused to let that sink in. Furthermore, I continued, dropping the atomic bomb. That code is currently designated as a critical national security asset by the Federal Critical Systems Bureau. If you acquire Neurogate under the current terms, you will be attempting to transfer a restricted federal asset to a multinational entity without clearance. That is a violation of the Espionage Act and about a dozen export control laws. The moment you sign that deal, the Department of Justice will freeze your assets, not just Neurogate's. MS. Sterling went pale. She dropped the pen she was holding. He didn't tell us it was classified, she whispered. Because he is arrogant, I said, and because he thinks he owns me. He thinks he owns my work. But he is wrong on both counts. The room was thick with tension. The Hellark team began whispering frantically among themselves. They were ready to work. I could see it. They were going to pull the plug on the deal, sue Damien for fraud, and run for the hills. That would have been satisfying, but it wasn't enough. I didn't just want the deal to fail. I want Damien to be destroyed publicly. I needed the deal to go through, but on my terms. Wait, I said, holding up a hand. I am not here to kill the deal. I am here to restructure it. MS. Sterling looked at me wearily. How do you want the tech? I said it is the only thing in Neurogate that actually works. The rest is just marketing and vaporware. So here is my proposal. I laid out the heist plan. It was complex, elegant, and lethal. You will sign a separate exclusive licensing agreement directly with Monroe Defense. I explained this agreement will supersede any claims Damien has made. You will pay Monroe Defense directly for the IP rights. The money does not go to Neurogate. It goes to me and the acquisition. MS. Sterling asked, you proceed with the acquisition of Neurogate. I said, but we added a clause, a material misrepresentation clause. It states that if any primary shareholder, meaning Damien, is found to have falsified financial or legal data prior to closing, his equity is immediately forfeited to cover the liability. Arthur, who had recovered from his fine shock, leaned forward. And since we have evidence that Damien has been using company funds to pay personal crypto debts, that clause will trigger the moment the ink is dry. Exactly. I said, we also added a change of control provision. The moment the deal is signed, the board is reconstituted. You Hellark take majority control, and your first act as the new owners will be to fire the CEO for cause. MS. Sterling looked at the documents. She looked at the federal classification. She realized that I was offering her the only safe path through the minefield. If she walked away, A competitor might get the tech. If she signed Damien's version, she went to jail. If she signed my version, she got the tech, the company, and protection from the government. And Damien, she asked, when do we tell him? You don't, I said. That is the condition. He believes the deal is proceeding exactly as he planned. He believes he is selling the company for $1.2 billion and walking away a king. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper. The signing ceremony is scheduled for the anniversary party at Cross Heights. 200 guests, the press, his family. I want him to sign the papers there. I want him to give his victory speech. I want him to think he has won. And then, I said, Arthur will correct the record. Miss Sterling looked at me for a long moment. A slow smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a predator recognizing another predator. You are ruthless, Mrs. Cross, she said. I am efficient, I replied. Do we have a deal? We have a deal. We spent the next 3 hours red-rafting the contracts. Arthur Lane was brilliant. He knew exactly where Damon had buried the bodies. He provided the Hellock lawyers with the ledger entries showing Damon's embezzlement of company funds to pay for the lifestyle maintenance of the Cross family. Here, Arthur said, pointing to a line item, $3 million withdrawn last month for marketing expenses. It actually went to a shell company in the Caymans that holds his Bitcoin wallet. That is grand larceny and securities fraud. We will use that, Ms. Sterling said, typing furiously. We will structure the forfeit clause so that this specific transaction triggers the equity seizure. By the time we finished, the contract was a masterpiece of legal engineering. On the surface, it looked like the deal of the century for Damien. Underneath, it was a death warrant for his career. I stood up to leave. One last thing, I said. The federal agencies, the SEC and the FCSB, they are monitoring this. We are aware, MS. Sterling said, we will file the necessary disclosures with them immediately after the signing. We will position ourselves as the white knights who uncovered the fraud and cleaned up the company. Good, I said. Agent Hale is expecting your call. I walked out of the Hellark Tower and into the bustling streets of Kingsford City. The wind was cold, but I didn't feel it. I felt electric. I called Arthur from a burner phone 10 minutes later. Did he buy it? I asked. I just got off the phone with him. Arthur said, I told him the meeting was tough, that Monroe defense was difficult, but that I bullied them into signing a waiver. I told him the deal is ready to sign at the party, and he laughed. Arthur said he called me a good dog. He is ecstatic. Claire, he thinks he just cleared $1 billion. He cleared the path to his own cell. I said, the stage was set. The script was written. The actors knew their lines. All that was left was the performance. I returned to Lakehurst 2 days later. The house was buzzing with preparations for the party. Caterers were setting up tents. Florists were arranging thousands of dollars worth of white leaves. Damien greeted me with a kiss that felt like a brand. He was manic with energy, his eyes bright with the anticipation of wealth. You are back, he crowed, spinning me around. Just in time. It is going to be the night of our lives, Claire. The night the world finally understands who Damien Cross is. I am sure they will, I said, smoothing his lapel. I have a surprise for the speech, he said, winking. I am going to give you a special shout-out. Something funny about how lucky you are. I can't wait to hear it, I said. I went upstairs to my dressing room. My dress for the evening was hanging on the door. It was a deep midnight blue velvet, elegant, stately, and dark enough to hide in the shadows until it was time to strike. I received a final text from Agent Hale. Teams are in position. We will wait for the lawyer to expose the fraud before we execute the warrant. We want the confession on tape. I looked at the mirror. The girl from Maple Ridge was gone. The woman looking back at me was the CEO of Monroe Defense Analytics. I was ready. The plan relied on one specific trigger, a signal that would let Arthur know it was time to stand up and destroy the fantasy. We had agreed that Damien needed to be at the absolute height of his arrogance. He needed to be fully committed to the lie. I knew my husband. I knew exactly what he would say when he had an audience. He wouldn't be able to resist the urge to belittle me, to elevate himself. I texted Arthur one last command. Wait for the insult. Wait for him to say I married up. That is the kill code. Arthur replied instantly. Understood. I put on the dress. I put on the diamond earrings Damien had bought me with money he borrowed against my future. I put on the smile of the supportive wife. And then I walked downstairs to welcome the guests to my husband's execution. The flight back to Westmont felt less like a return home and more like an infiltration behind enemy lines. I landed at the private airfield, not on the cross-family jet, which Damien was undoubtedly using to ferry investors or his mistress, but on a commercial flight that landed 40 minutes late. There was no driver waiting for me. No black SUV with tinted windows, no text message asking if I had landed safely. There was just a single notification from Damien that had arrived 3 hours ago. Come straight to Cross Heights tonight. Do not go to the condo. Everyone is waiting for you at the party. It is the biggest night of our lives. I took a ride share to the estate. As the car wound its way up the winding roads of the hills, the city of Lakehurst glittering below like a spilled jewelry box, I felt a profound sense of detachment. I was looking at the landscape, not as a resident, but as a surveyor marking a demolition site. When the row iron gates of Cross Heights came into view, the scale of Damien's desperation became visible. The driveway was not just lined with cars. It was a parking lot of excess. There were valets running back and forth, parking Bentleys and Aston Martins on the pristine lawn. Searchlights swept the night sky, renting the darkness with beams of pure white light. It looked less like an anniversary party and more like a coronation. I entered the house through the side servants' entrance, avoiding the red carpet out front. I needed a moment before the performance began. I needed to see the battlefield. I walked up the back stairs to the master's suite. The hallway smelled of fresh leaves and expensive cleaning products, the scent of a hotel, not home. When I pushed open the double doors to our bedroom, I stopped. The room had been purged. It was subtle, but to me it was violent. The reading chair where I used to sit with my laptop was gone, replaced by a brooding, masculine leather recliner. The bookshelves, once filled with my technical manuals and novels, were now stocked with leather-bound sets of encyclopedias that I knew Damien had never opened. I walked to the closet. My clothes had been compressed, my suits, my dresses, my life all shoved into a single narrow section at the far end. The rest of the expansive space was filled with Damien's new wardrobe, rows of Italian suits, velvet dinner jackets, and shoes that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. But the real blow was waiting on the vanity table. I sat down on the velvet stool. The surface was cluttered. Among my usual bottles of serum and moisturizer, there were intruders. A bottle of perfume that smelled like sugared violets, sickly sweet and aggressive. A tube of lipstick and a shade of neon pink that I would never wear. A hairbrush with strands of blonde hair caught in the bristles. He hadn't even bothered to hide it. Or perhaps he wanted me to find it. He wanted me to know that I had been replaced in function, if not yet in title. I stared at the blonde hair in the brush. A month ago, this would have broken me. I would have sat here and wept for the 7 years I wasted. Now I just feel cold. I picked up the perfume bottle, examined the label, and set it back down exactly where I found it. It was evidence, and evidence was not emotional. It was useful. I stood up, smoothed the midnight blue velvet of my gown, and checked my reflection. The woman in the mirror was terrified, but she was hiding it behind a mask of ice. "Showtime," I whispered. I walked down the grand staircase. The noise of the party rose up to meet me. A roar of laughter, clinking glass, and a live jazz band playing something frantic and upbeat. At the bottom of the stairs, Evelyn was waiting. She looked like a queen mother in silver sequins, her hair sprayed into an immobile helmet of perfection. She spotted me and her eyes narrowed, inspecting me for flaws. "You are late," she said, stepping forward to intercept me before I could reach the main hall. She didn't hug me. She gripped my forearm with fingers that felt like talons. The flight was delayed. "Evelyn," I said. "Excuse," she hissed, her smile fixed for the benefit of a passing waiter. "Listen to me, Claire. Tonight is critical. The investors from Hellark are here. The press is here. Damien is about to announce the deal. You will stand by his side. You will smile. You will look at him like he is the sun and the moon. Do you understand?" I understand my role, Evelyn, I said, gently pulling my arm from her grip. Good, she said, smoothing the fabric of my dress with a critical eye. At least you wore something decent. Try not to fade into the wallpaper. She turned and marched away, clearing a path through the guests like an icebreaker ship. I followed her into the ballroom. It was dazzling. The room was packed with the elite of Westmont. I saw faces I recognized from the society pages: senators, tech mogul, hedge fund managers. They were drinking Damien's champagne and eating his caviar, completely unaware that the man footing the bill was technically insolvent. Damien was in the center of the room holding court. He looked radiant. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin, his hair perfectly coiffed. He was laughing at something a banker was saying, his head thrown back, projecting the image of a man without a care in the world. He saw me approach for a second. His eyes flickered with annoyance, but then the mask slammed down. Claire, he exclaimed, opening his arms wide. He pulled me into a hug that was loose and performative. He kissed the air next to my cheek, turning me so that we faced the photographer who had just materialized. Smile. He hissed through his teeth. Flash, flash, flash. I missed you. I lied, my voice loud enough for the reporter to hear. And I you, darling, Damon said. Then he leaned in close, his lips brushing my ear. The warmth of his breath made my skin crawl. Don't do anything to embarrass me tonight. Claire, stay in your lane. This night is about me, not you. He pulled back, beaming at the camera. Excuse us, gentlemen. My wife has been away serving her country, but tonight she's just mine. He patted my shoulder 2 condescending taps and turned back to the investors. Effectively dismissing me, I drifted away, letting the current of the crowd carry me toward the periphery. I needed to find the players. I made my way toward the green room, a cordoned-off VIP area near the stage where the serious money was gathered. I didn't go in. I just skirted the edge. I saw them, the team from Heliot Global MS. Sterling was there wearing a sharp black suit that made her look like a panther among house cats. She was holding a glass of mineral water, looking bored. Standing next to her was Arthur Lane. Arthur looked pale. He was sweating slightly, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked like a man standing on a trap door, waiting for the lever to be pulled. He looked up and saw me, our eyes locked across the room. I gave a microscopic nod. Arthur took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and blinked. Once slowly, everything is in place. I exhaled. The contract was ready. The trap was armed. I continued my circuit of the room near the bar. I heard a familiar grating laugh. Logan was holding court with a group of young influencers, bell hanging off his arm. She was wearing a dress that was cut dangerously low, shimmering with gold sequins. It matched the perfume on my vanity. It is a done deal, Logan was saying loudly enough for half the room to hear. $1.2 billion. Can you imagine? My brother is a genius. We are going to buy a private island in the Caribbean next month. No more winter for the Crossed family. Belle giggled, sipping a pink cocktail. Damon said, he's going to buy me a horse, she chirped. A white one, just like in the movies. He buys everyone horses, Logan bragged. We are royalty now, baby. I watched them with clinical fascination. They were so confident. They were spending money that had already been earmarked by the federal government for seizure. They were building castles on a foundation of quicksand. Enjoy the horse, Belle, I thought. I hope it eats hay, because that is all you will be able to afford. I moved away from them, finding my assigned seat. Of course, I was not at the head table. The head table was occupied by Damien, his parents, Logan, Belle, and the executives from Helark, my place card. Mrs. Claire Cross was at table 14. It was in the back corner near the kitchen doors. I was seated with the unimportant plus ones, the third wife of a retired senator, the husband of a junior VP, and a few people who looked like they had won a ticket in a raffle. It was a deliberate slight. Damien was putting me in the audience. He wanted me to watch his triumph from the cheap seats. I sat down. The waiter poured me a glass of wine. I didn't drink it. I placed my hands in my lap, interlaced my fingers, and waited. The lights in the ballroom dimmed. A spotlight swept across the ceiling, cutting through the haze of expensive perfume and ego. The music shifted from jazz to a dramatic orchestral swell, something that sounded like the soundtrack to a superhero movie. The master of ceremonies, a local news anchor hired for the night, stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed over the speakers. "Distinguished guests, tonight we are not just celebrating an anniversary. We are witnessing history." The crowd quieted. All eyes turned to the stage. "We are here to celebrate a visionary, a man who started with nothing but a dream and built an empire that now stands at the pinnacle of global technology. A man who proves that the American dream is alive and well." I saw Damien at the head table. He was adjusting his cufflinks. He looked hungry. He looked ready to consume the adoration of the room. "Please welcome the founder and CEO of Newrigate Labs, Mr. Damien Cross." The room erupted. Thunderous applause. People stood up. Logan was whistling. Evelyn was clapping with regal dignity. Damien stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He walked up the stairs to the stage, bathing in the spotlight. He shook the MC's hand and took the microphone. He stood there for a moment, letting the applause wash over him. He looked out at the sea of faces. He looked at the Hellark executives. He looked at his parents, and then, for a brief second, he looked toward the back of the room, searching for table 14. He found me. Even in the darkness, I could feel his gaze. It was a look of total dominance. "Look at me." His eyes said, "Look at what I did without you." He smiled, that charming predatory smile that had fooled me 7 years ago. "Thank you," Damon said, his voice rich and smooth. "Thank you all. You are too kind." He placed his hand on the podium. "They say that behind every great man there is a great woman." He began, pausing for effect. I leaned forward slightly. My heart was a cold stone in my chest. "Say it." I thought, "Say the line, Damien, dig the grave." But sometimes Damon continued, chuckling. "The man has to drag everyone else up the mountain with him." The crowd laughed. 7 years ago, I made a choice. He said, "I chose to share my life. And tonight, I want to talk about that journey, about the burdens we carry and the rewards we reap." He took a breath. He was about to deliver the punchline. He was about to initiate his own destruction. I sat back in my chair. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I just watched the spotlight, waiting for the shadow to fall. Damien stood on that stage bathed in a cone of white light, and he began to rewrite history. "People ask me," he said, his voice dropping to that intimate confessional register he had perfected for TD Talks, "how a kid from Westmont built a unicorn. They want the secret source. They want the algorithm." He chuckled, leaning against the podium as if he were sharing a joke with an old friend. But the truth is, it was just grit. It was nights spent in a freezing garage, coding until my fingers were numb. It was surviving on stale pizza and sheer willpower. I remember looking at the lines of code, the early architecture of Newrigate, and knowing that I was building something that would change the world. I watched him from table 14. My hands were folded in my lap. I remembered those nights differently. I remembered him passing out on the sofa while I debugged his sloppy syntax until 4 in the morning. I remembered him throwing a keyboard across the room because he couldn't figure out a recursive loop, leaving me to fix it while he went for a drive to cool off. "And Claire," he said, pivoting his body toward where I sat in the shadows. The spotlight followed him, forcing the audience to crane their necks to look at me. My beautiful Claire. She was there in the background, brewing the coffee, reading back the error logs I printed out, keeping the noise down so the genius could work. A few people chuckled. It was a soft, diminishing sound. He was reducing my contribution to that of a librarian. He raised his champagne flute. The light caught the crystal, turning it into a star. "And look at us now," he beamed. "Tonight, we are celebrating not just an anniversary, but a testament to what happens when you hitch your wagon to a star." People look at my wife and they whisper. They wonder how a girl from a small town ends up in a dress like that in a house like this. He paused, letting the silence stretch, savoring the punchline. "Well, let us be honest," he announced, his voice booming. "She really married up. Claire is the perfect example of hitting the jackpot. She won the lottery without buying a ticket, and I am happy to be her prize." The room erupted. It was a wave of laughter that crashed over me. It wasn't warm. It was sharp, jagged, and filled with the cruel relief of people who were glad they weren't the ones being roasted. I saw Belle laughing so hard she had to hold onto Logan's arm. I saw Evelyn nodding, her face a mask of smug validation. The master of ceremonies, sensing the vibe, leaned into the microphone. Let us hope she signed a good prenup. Right, folks? Never know when luck runs out. More laughter. I didn't move. I didn't frown. I kept my face perfectly neutral like a statue carved from ice. Keep talking, Damien. I thought you're doing great. Just a little more. Damien, emboldened by the reaction, decided to go for the kill. He wanted to prove not just his benevolence, but his dominance. But seriously, he said, changing his tone to serious business mogul, I take care of my own. That is why I am thrilled to announce that as of this afternoon, Nuragit Labs has entered into a definitive agreement to be acquired by Hellark Global for a valuation of $1.2 billion. Gasps of admiration filled the room. Applause broke out louder this time. Money always got a standing ovation. And the jewel of this deal? Damien shouted over the applause. Our proprietary security framework, the Neuro's Shield Core. It is a system I designed to be impenetrable, a system so advanced that even the federal government has taken notice. It is the heart of our value, and it is entirely 100% a Nuragit asset. He puffed out his chest. I have also taken steps to ensure my family is protected. I have restructured our entire asset portfolio. I have moved things around, optimized the trusts, and simplified the ownership. My wife, he gestured to me again, dismissing me with a wave, doesn't need to worry her pretty head about the complex numbers. I have handled it. She will always be taken care of as long as she remembers who signs the checks. He raised his glass higher to Nuragate to the future. To marry up. To marry up. The crowd echoed. It was the peak, the absolute zenith of his hubris. And then a chair scraped against the floor. It was a harsh, dissonant sound in the celebratory atmosphere. In the front row near the stage, Arthur Lane stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had just noticed a typo on a menu. He buttoned his jacket slowly. Damien looked down, confused. What are you doing? Sit down. We are toasting. Arthur ignored him. He turned to the sound technician at the side of the stage and gestured for a microphone. The technician, confused but recognizing the company lawyer, handed him a wireless mic. Arthur cleared his throat. The sound echoed through the speakers, silencing the room. If I may, Mr. Cross, Arthur said, his voice calm, measured, and terrifyingly polite. I apologize for the interruption, but there is a small detail regarding your speech that requires a correction, specifically regarding the direction. The room went deadly silent, the kind of silence where you can hear ice melting in a glass. Damien frowned, his smile faltering. He laughed nervously. The direction, Arthur. Have you had too much to drink? This is a party. We can talk to a legal shop on Monday. I am afraid we cannot wait until Monday, Arthur said, because the contract you just referenced, the one with Hellark Global, it was signed at 4 this afternoon, which means the representations you made in it are now a matter of legal record. Arthur reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. They were clipped together with a red tab. You just stated to this room and to your investors that Nuragit Labs owns the newer Shield security framework, Arthur said. You claimed it is a proprietary asset of the company you founded. Because it is, Damien snapped, his patience fraying. I paid for the development. I own it. Actually, Arthur said, looking down at the paper, you do not. According to the United States Patent and Trademark Office and the Copyright Office, the source code for that framework is the sole intellectual property of a completely separate entity. Damien rolled his eyes. Oh, please don't tell me there is some patent troll suing us. I will crush him. It is not a patent troll, Damien, Arthur said softly. The entity is called Monroe Defense Analytics, LLC. Damien froze. The name hit him. I saw the recognition flicker in his eyes. The memory of the tax return, the side hustle, the company he had tried to bully me into signing over. Monroe, Damien laughed. A desperate, breathless sound. That is my wife's little consulting gig. It is a show. I am absorbing it into the trust next week. It is a nut issue. It is not a shell, Arthur corrected, and it has not been absorbed. In fact, according to the documents filed with the state of Delaware and the Department of Defense, Monroe Defense Analytics is an independent defense contractor with active federal clearance. Arthur looked up from the paper and looked directly at Damien, and its sole owner is Claire Monroe Cross. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People turned to look at me. I didn't look away. I picked up my glass of wine and took a slow, deliberate sip. Damien turned pale. Stop this. You are fired. Get out. I resigned this morning. Damien, Arthur said, effective immediately upon the signing of the Hellark deal, which brings me to the second point. Arthur held up another document. This one had a government seal on it. You just claimed credit for the security layer. You claimed you restructured your assets to optimize ownership. But according to the diligence report filed by Hellark Global, which they co-signed with Monroe Defense about an hour ago, the inclusion of the Monroe framework in your Newrigate pitch deck was unauthorized. Damien gripped the podium. His knuckles were white. What are you talking about? Help sign the deal with me. They signed a deal to acquire Newrigate, Arthur clarified. But they signed a separate exclusive licensing agreement for the security technology with Mrs. Cross directly. The crowd gasped. The investors from Hellark MS. Sterling and her team remained seated looking grim and satisfied. They didn't jump up to defend Damien. They watched him burn, and Arthur continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming grave. According to a confirmation we received from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Critical Systems Bureau about 40 minutes ago, your attempt to sell a federally restricted asset that you do not own, combined with the falsified asset restructuring you performed on the family trust to cover your personal debts. Arthur paused. He looked at Damien with something almost like pity. It constitutes securities fraud, wire fraud, and the theft of government-protected intellectual property. You are lying, Damien screamed, losing his composure entirely. I am Damien Cross. I built this. She is nothing. She's just a wife. Arthur closed the folder. The snap echoed like a gunshot. Legally speaking. Mr. Cross, Arthur said, looking at the stunned audience. The person who married up in this equation was you. He lowered the microphone for a heartbeat. No one moved. Damon stood on the stage, the spotlight still hitting him, but now it looked less like a halo and more like the light of an interrogation room. He looked at the Hellark table, pleading with his eyes. Ms. Sterling simply checked her watch. He looked at his parents. Evelyn was clutching her pearls, her mouth open in horror. Harold looked like he was having a stroke. Then Damien looked at me. He saw the girl he had ignored for 7 years. He saw the wife he had tried to erase. He saw the passenger he thought he was carrying. And for the first time, he realized who was actually driving the car. Damien was still gripping the podium, his knuckles white, trying to laugh. It was a terrible sound, a dry rattle that bounced off the silent walls of the ballroom. This is a joke, he stammered, looking around at the sea of shocked faces. Arthur, this is a very poor joke, security. Get him off the mic. He is clearly drunk. He turned to the Hellark executives, his smile twitching like a dying nerve. M. Sterling, please ignore him. Disgruntled employee, you know how it is. We have the papers ready to sign. We do not need security, Mr. Cross. A deep voice boomed from the back of the room. The double doors of the grand entrance, usually reserved for the arrival of the family, swung open with a violent force that shook the chandeliers. A phalanx of people walked in. They were not wearing tuxedos. They were not wearing evening gowns. They were wearing dark, ill-fitting government suits and blue windbreakers emblazoned with yellow letters. Sec D A J S C S B. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. I watched from my table, sipping my wine as the procession marched toward the stage. It was not a raid. It was a parade of consequences. Leading them was Agent Marcus Hale. He looked even more imposing in the ambient light of the ballroom than he had in the bunker in Redford. He walked up the steps to the stage, ignoring Damien's protests, and flashed a badge that caught the glare of the spotlight. I am Agent Marcus Hale, he announced, his voice projecting without a microphone. I am the lead investigator for the Financial Crimes Division, working in conjunction with the Federal Critical Systems Bureau. I am executing the federal warrant for the seizure of all electronic devices and physical records belonging to Newrigate Labs and Mr. Damien Cross. Damon took a step back, nearly tripping over a monitor cable. You cannot do this. This is a private event. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent, Hale said, placing a heavy document on the podium, though I suggest you start exercising it immediately. Hale signaled to a technician standing near the audiovisual booth, changed the feed. The massive screens behind the stage, which had been looping a montage of Damien's greatest moments, suddenly flickered. The image of Damien shaking hands with a senator vanished. In its place, a complex spiderweb of financial transactions appeared. It was the flowchart I had helped Arthur build. It showed money leaving the Newrigate operating accounts, moving through a shell company in the Cayman Islands, and ending up in a high-risk crypto wallet registered to Damien's personal email. The room gasped. Then the slide changed. It was a screenshot of an email Damien had sent to his accountant 2 weeks ago. Subject: adjust the EBITDA body. Just make the numbers work for the Hellark audit. Move the debt to the marketing column. If they ask about the security layer, tell them we own it outright. My wife does not know what she has. I am using her government assets to pump the valuation. She is too busy playing secretary to notice. Then came the text messages to Logan. Logan, is Claire going to be a problem with the sale? Damon, Claire is a prop. I will get her to sign whatever I want. She is lucky I let her live in the house. I heard a glass shatter. Someone at a nearby table had dropped their drink. The humiliation was total. It was absolute. Damien stood there, his own words towering over him on a 2020 screen, stripping him naked in front of the very people he had tried to impress. Miss Sterling stood up at the head table. She didn't look at Damien. She looked at the camera crews that were now frantically recording. On behalf of Hellark Global, she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade, I am activating the material breach clause of our acquisition agreement. Given the evidence of fraud and the misrepresentation of assets presented here, the offer to purchase Newrigate Labs is officially rescinded. Damien let out a strangled cry. You signed it. You cannot back out. However, Ms. Sterling continued, ignoring him. Hellark remains committed to our separate and exclusive agreement with Monroe Defense Analytics. We will be proceeding with the transfer of the security intellectual property with payment directed solely to Mrs. Claire Monroe Cross. The heir left the room. Damien looked at Ms. Sterling, then at the screen, then at Arthur. Arthur Lane stepped forward holding one final piece of paper. And Mr. Cross, Arthur said, per the emergency resolution passed by the minority shareholders and the board just 10 minutes ago via conference call. Your tenure as CEO of Newrigate is suspended, effective immediately pending a federal investigation. Damien looked like a man who had been shot, but hadn't realized he was bleeding yet. He spun around, his eyes wild, searching the room until they landed on me. I was still sitting at table 14. I was the only person in the room who wasn't standing or shouting. Claire, he whispered into the microphone. Then he screamed it. Claire, what did you do? I stood up. I didn't rush. I smoothed the velvet of my dress. I picked up my clutch. I walked through the silent crowd, the heels of my shoes clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. I walked past the shocked faces of the people who had laughed at me 10 minutes ago. I walked past Logan, who was frantically deleting messages from his phone. I walked up the stairs to the stage. Agent Hale stepped aside to let me pass. I stood in front of Damien. He looked small. The tuxedo that had fit him so perfectly before now looked like a costume on a child. I reached out and took the microphone from his hand. He didn't fight me. He was too paralyzed by shock. I did not do anything, Damien, I said. My voice was calm, steady, and terrifyingly cold. I just followed your advice. You always told me to be an asset to the family. You told me to learn how to manage wealth. I leaned in closer so only he and the 200 people listening could hear the edge in my voice. I just optimized the assets. I said, I just optimized them in the right direction. You ruined me, he hissed, tears of rage pricking his eyes. I made you. No, I said, you distracted me. There is a difference. He is lying. Evelyn screamed from the floor. She tried to rush the stage, her face twisted in a mask of fury. She is a thief. That is my son's money. Arrest her. 2 federal agents intercepted her before she could reach the stairs. She thrashed against them, her dignity dissolving into hysteria. Harold Cross was standing by the Hellark table, sweating profusely, trying to grab MS. Sterling's arm. It is a misunderstanding, Harold pleaded. We can fix the accounting. It is just a rounding error. Get your hands off me, MS. Sterling said, signaling for her own security detail. Logan was already at the exit, trying to slip out the side door, but an agent blocked his path. Mr. Cross, we need your phone now. The chaos was a symphony, and I was the conductor. Agent Hale stepped back to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, this is now a crime scene. Please vacate the area. Mr. Cross, I am placing you under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and the theft of government property. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal clipped. It was the loudest sound in the world. Turn around, Hale ordered. Damien turned. He looked at the audience. The photographers who had been invited to capture his coronation were now capturing his funeral. The flashes popped rapidly, a strobe light of disaster, illuminating his tear-streaked face and the shiny metal binding his wrists. I am freezing all assets associated with the Cross Family Trust, Hale announced to the room. Any attempt to move funds from this moment forward will be considered obstruction of justice that includes the accounts of Mr. Harold Cross and Mrs. Evelyn Cross pending a forensic audit of the initial seed capital for Newrigate. Evelyn wailed. The dynasty wasn't just dead. It was bankrupt. 2 agents took Damien by the arms and began to march him off the stage. As they passed me, Damien dug his heels in. He looked at me. The arrogance was gone. The anger was gone. There was only the pathetic, naked fear of a man who had never faced a consequence in his life. Claire, he begged, his voice cracking. Please tell them. Tell them we can work this out. I am your husband. We are a team. Don't let them take me. He looked at me with the eyes of a dog waiting to be kicked. He expected me to fold. He expected the good wife to surface and save him. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had erased my name, stolen my work, and laughed about it to a room full of strangers. I raised the glass of wine I was still holding. You said one thing that was true tonight. Damien, I said softly. The microphone caught every syllable. The room went silent one last time. I really did marry up. I said. I paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. But not with you. I just married up with the only things I can actually trust. I smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I had worn in 7 years. My freedom and my own name. I toasted him. Goodbye, Damien. The agents shoved him forward. He was dragged out the side door. His tuxedo bunched up around his shoulders, sobbing. The music had stopped. The party was over. The guests were whispering, scrambling for their coats, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Cross family. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I walked down the stairs. I walked past Arthur Lane, who gave me a small, respectful nod. I walked past the Hellark team, who looked at me with something approaching fear. I walked down the long hallway lined with the portraits of Damien's ancestors. I didn't look back. Behind me, the empire of Newrigate was crumbling into dust and police tape. Ahead of me, the night air was cool and clean. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out onto the driveway. The searchlights were still sweeping the sky, but now they felt like they were lighting the way for me. I took a deep breath. It tasted like ozone and victory. My phone buzzed in my clutch. A notification from the bank. The first licensing payment from Hellark Global had just cleared. The number was long, beautiful, and entirely mine. I walked toward the waiting taxi, leaving the mansion on the hill to burn in the fires of its own making. Thanked you so much for listening to this story on Azad Revenge Stories. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. Are you listening from a busy city like New York, a quiet town in Europe, or somewhere else entirely? Please let me know in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And if you enjoyed seeing Claire take back her power, please smash that like button, hit subscribe on Azad Revenge Stories, and turn on the hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to me.